You can support this project by subscribing on Spotify for £3 a month.
You are listening to the Nostalgia Podcast with me, Brian Scarf, and this week, my guest, Father Robert Nixon, who our listeners may well be familiar with from a previous episode, an enormously popular episode. Father Robert Nixon is a Catholic priest and a monk of the Abbey of the Most Holy Trinity in New Norcia, Western Australia. He is an experienced educator, musician, composer, and liturgist, as well as a prolific translator. His works include the Resurrection series, which are published by Tan Books, which currently total at least 13 volumes, The Devil's Bagpipe, The True Life of Martin Luther, which is published by Sensus Fidelium Press, and a series of books and tracts by Hadean Press, covering some of the stranger aspects of the medieval Catholic tradition, including Brontomantia, Prognostication by Thunder, by the Venerable Bede, and the Magical Amulets of the Ancient Sages by the Benedictine abbot Johannes Trithemius. How are you doing, Father?
I'm very well, thank you, Brian. It's great to be back with you again and to have another opportunity of sharing with your listeners.
I hear that you've just returned from a community holiday somewhere in Australia. Where did you go and how was that?
Absolutely. So we are here in New Norcia, which is in Western Australia, and we went not very far, but to the seaside. So we're off the coast. We're kind of in the desert here almost. And a group of monks went together and we went to a unit by the seaside, and while we have our holidays together, we maintain many elements of monastic life. We pray together several times a day. We celebrate the Holy Mass together, and we continue to live as a community. But at the same time, we're free from our regular duties, and our timetable is somewhat more relaxed. So that means not for me sleeping in, but rather the opportunity of doing some extra reading, some extra reflection, some extra walking, and so forth. So it was a very pleasant time. And come back ready for another monastic year. And back at the monastery here, it is now about 42 degrees Celsius.
Good heavens.
So yes, indeed. So at this time of the year, we don't tend to get very many visitors, and but everything is back to normal as far as our duties and timetables are concerned.
So I wanted to speak to you today on a number of things, but starting with an interesting tract that you've published, including some of your own original research on the Santa Muerte cult, which is one of the most popular and widespread devotions in Latin America. It's not something that's very familiar, I think, to most Anglophone readers in terms of real practice within the Catholic Church. It's got a very strange, kind of very theatrical reputation. People see it expressed in movies, but generally speaking, it's got a very negative spin in the Anglo world. What made you interested in this question?
You know, it was actually a chance discovery that made me interested. I was reading about Saint Mariano de Jesus, as I should say, who was a saint who lived in the 17th century in Ecuador. And she was She's, in fact, the first Ecuadorian to be canonized, the second Latin American to be canonized, I believe, following Saint Rose of Lima. She lived for only a very short time, and she's one of these saints who, in terms of her works in the world, did very little. She only lived to about the age of 25 or so. And but I was interested in her for various reasons. And when I read her life, I discovered that when her canonization was promoted by the Bishop of Quito, that he also promoted the canonization of her niece. Now, her niece was only a few years younger than her. Her niece was called Donna Sebastiana. And of course, I recognize that as being what this Santa Muerte figure is. But there were some other remarkable features which alerted me to this connection. Firstly, her day of birth, which would have become her feast day because she wasn't a martyr, was August the 15th, which is the traditional day of observation of the Santa Muerte. Also, one of the remarkable things in her life is that towards the end of her life, and she died very young, I'll tell you about this in a moment, she actually prayed to death, a personification of death. She prayed that death might come and take her away from her difficult situation in life. And also, she had founded with her aunt, Saint Mariana, this congregation of the good death during her lifetime. So, what is more than the Archbishop of Quito went and served in Mexico. So the connection between what was originally this religious confraternity of a good death, and there were several of those, I mean, there were many of them around the world. That was kind of a usual thing. There were lots of pious, Catholic pious societies, particularly in the Spanish-speaking world at the time. There still are to this day, I should say. And the connection with this Donna Sebastiana, who has hitherto remained a very mysterious figure. People have said, you know, who is this? Is she some kind of transformed pagan goddess or deity? Is she a female form of Saint Sebastian? No, she's actually Donna Sebastiana, whose feast day is August the 15th, who has the status of venerable within the church. So in fact, its origins are quite legitimate as a Catholic religious phenomenon. And you know, to find that out, the interesting thing was, when I came across that, I looked through the secondary literature on this subject, and there's a lot of secondary literature, but none of them identify this particular connection, which apparently had been completely lost or overlooked. And there are a number of reasons why it would have been overlooked, which I'll talk about in a little while. And so I believe that this captures what was the original nature of this observational cult, as you might observe. And as you mentioned, it has become very popular in Mexico and other parts of the Latin Spanish-speaking world. There is awareness of it also in the Anglophone world now, but it's completely lost its religious roots, and in a lot of cases, and become something kind of very distorted and quite sinister in recent times. Interestingly, only in the last couple of decades, if you go back further than this, you'll find that it's hardly there at all. So I felt it was worthwhile presenting this information on someone who is not quite a canonized saint, but was declared a servant of God, therefore has the title of venerable, and whose aunt is Saint Mariana of Quito, who is the first canonized Ecuadorian and one of the very popular saints to this day in Latin America and to a lesser extent in the English-speaking world.
That's very interesting indeed. Do you know why there has been an emergence of this more sinister form of the cult in recent decades? Do you think that's connected to the sort of the drug and gang violence that's emerged?
To be honest, I am not really an expert on the drug and gang culture. But, conjecturally, it seems to have become a type of, I can't speak of the spiritual perspective of people in that situation, but I guess they're looking for something. And they, in many cases, obviously, as Mexicans, they're rooted in Catholic culture. So it's something which is fundamentally a part of their way of thinking. But this somehow seems to be rebellious or outsider or countercultural, and certainly in the English-speaking world, that would seem to account for its popularity. And often, interestingly, these things become commercially pushed, I'd say almost products. And a good case of that would be Halloween. In Australia, Halloween was not a thing at all until about 10 years ago, and then it was supermarkets that started to push it, to sell the kind of paraphernalia, food and everything that was popular in North America. And I think this is a case also where there is marketing at work. And the worrying thing is that it has become separated from its true religious significance, which I think is, as a priest, I feel it's important to recapture these things, to say, this is actually something which was Christian, which is originally Christian, and which can be Christian again if it's treated properly.
Interesting. So but the risk in some ways is that there can be an overreaction, and that a legitimate pushback against the commercialization and abuse of a cult can be mixed with a kind of suspicion towards the representations of death that skulls and skeletons might have, whereas the medieval church would have decorated their certain areas with skulls and bones, sometimes real, sometimes.
Absolutely, Brian. And at the entrance of our monastery chapel, we have a crucifix. It's a Spanish crucifix. It's a fairly, I would guess you could say, explicit type of one, and it has the skull and crossbones above the body of Jesus Christ, which a lot of people, are very confused by. Because they've never seen anything like that before. But the reality is that any religious system has to deal with the reality of death. And this is something which in modern Christianity and modern Western civilization in general, we're somewhat uncomfortable with. We don't deny its reality, but we can sometimes reduce it simply to a medical outcome, and we don't talk about it. We don't think about it so much, and I think that we do need to come to terms with death during the course of our life, and certainly this is something which Saint Benedict speaks of in his rule. He says we should have death before our eyes daily. And, practically every system of spirituality and philosophy in the world, whether it's Buddhism, Stoicism, Platonism, has always encouraged this meditation on death. I think this is so important because it puts everything in life in the context of the finitude of this mortal life, the fact that the human soul is longing for something beyond death, and that ultimately we need to come to terms with death in the same way that we come to terms with birth and marriage and sickness and aging, that these are parts of the process which in its totality forms the mystery of life.
It seems that at least circumstantially, that at the same time that we are more and more uncomfortable with death, and we put it, we sort of push it to one side, that seems to at least somewhat correlate to the emergence of this extreme and sinister
You
cult.
know,
So it's almost as you repress it, it makes an ugly reappearance.
It does, absolutely. You know, and I believe this repression of the awareness of death, you know, and it actually goes beyond this. I believe there's also a repression of the sufferings of life, of the sorrows and so forth. And then this manifests itself, of course, in an underground way, because you can't just erase it from people's minds. So we see things like, you know, black metal, death metal, there's more extreme forms of horror and so forth. Now, in the past, these things were actually all present in you know, in the gargoyles in medieval cathedrals and in the artwork and in the literature. So there was no shying away from it. If we try to sanitize things too much, this is culture, art, fiction, then we don't in fact eliminate the dark side, but we just push it into cupboards. And when you do that, that's when it can become dangerous and distorted, because people are then put in a situation of either or, which of course is unhealthy, rather than both and, which
disintegrated rather than integrated.
Absolutely, yes.
Interesting. So as I was reading the life of Donna Sebastiana, the section where she's suffering so very deeply, and she exclaims sort of the prayer to the personification of death. I found it very interesting that the first thought that came to mind was the angel of death in the Old Testament, from where the story of the Israelites leaving Egypt, because that's perhaps the only time in the Bible where there's a very kind of clear and explicit mention of a character who is kind of in charge of death and might be considered personification of death. Do you think there's a relationship between those?
Yeah. Well, look, death. You know, this angel of death is understood as being a servant of God, not a servant of the devil. The angel of death comes at the appointed time. We do find a number of other personifications of death in the Bible, maybe rhetorical. Death, where is thy sting, and so forth. And then we also find in the book of Ecclesiasticus, you know, how death comes as a comfort to people in affliction without hope, who are bowed down by age or sickness, but then is an object of fear to other people who are in the prime of life or attached to the things of this world. So, you know, I think the personification of death is something which is widespread among a lot of different cultures. You know, we need only think about the grim reaper figure of the Middle Ages, who of course comes from classical mythology. And you know, when we read these kind of personifications of death, we should always remember that they're not to be taken literally, you know, in any sense at all. I mean, it doesn't make any more sense to have a personification of death as an actual character than a personification of birth or happiness or life or any number of things. It is a way of speaking, of conceptualizing. And I think that is why it is safe. We find also in the Canticle of the Sun of Saint Francis of Assisi, one of the verses is actually addressed to death. It says, "O thou most kind and gentle death," and then welcoming death at the appointed time as the bringer of peace and final rest, which then robs it of its aspect of terror. And I think, of course, St. Francis of Assisi didn't think for a moment that death was an actual entity or being. And I think no one in their right mind could actually think that. But it is a way of speaking. It is a way of artistic depiction. And one of the things which we find in this story of the Venerable Donna Sebastiana, as well as in the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, is this befriending of the personification of death, of being comfortable with it. And I think this is such an important thing, regardless of how young or old or healthy or unwell we may be. I believe each person should come to terms with the reality of death so that they can confront it without fear, without trepidation, without horror. It's a measure, I believe, of one's proper embrace of life, one's proper fulfillment of life and one's vocation to be comfortable with death.
Interesting. So in a previous in your previous appearance, you mentioned how in the Middle Ages there was a sort of a greater degree of liquidity in the doctrinal structures of the church, you might say, and I wondered whether there might be an interesting or illuminatory way of understanding that with regards to this particular cult, which the modern church, as I understand, has condemned, but at the same time is a kind of a manifestation of folk Catholicism, which would have never really, it's not something that's going to become integrated into the official structures of the church. How do you see the relationship of this cult to the church and its medieval manifestation?
Absolutely. Okay. So, what this is that we see in Mexico, this kind of pious society, which continued and then grew and morphed into this general, Santa Muerte cult. I should tell you a little bit about this Donna Sebastiana. She, like her aunt, Saint Mariana, her life was one of seclusion and prayer. And this life was modeled on the life of Saint Rose of Lima, who in turn modeled her life on Saint Catherine of Siena. Now, one of the things about these female saints in particular of the early modern period was they practiced actually some pretty horrific forms of penance, and this is, I think, is one of the great difficulties. With Catherine of Siena, of course, her work, her writings are still read, but a lot of the details of her life for the average Catholic are actually quite disturbing. A lot of the penitential practices. Now, with Rose of Lima and Mariana of Quito, probably even more so. So, frankly, they wouldn't be canonized today because of this fact, but this was the era of the flagellants and so forth. Now, the thing about Donna Sebastiana is she had vowed herself to virginity from a very early age, which a lot of female saints have done. But her father fell into difficult circumstances. Her father was a nobleman, basically, and formerly rich, but he had hard times. So he wanted to marry her off, which of course would force her to break her vow. This happened to a lot of martyrs, female martyrs of the early church, Saint Agnes, for example, Saint Cecilia. So Saint Mariana advised Donna Sebastiana that death was the only thing that could set her free, which is how she came to make this prayer in the cathedral, come to me, O death, rescue me from this situation. Of course, she didn't believe death was actually a deity. It was a prayer to God, but it was spoken in that way. So she wasn't canonized. And I believe the reason she wasn't canonized was that very fact that she had prayed for her own death. Now, shortly after, she did, in fact, die. She developed a bad fever and died. The remarkable thing was, after her death, a whole lot of the native people of Ecuador, of the, I guess you could call, say, Indians, assembled outside their house and venerated her and bought lots and lots of flowers and everything, and a lot of miracles took place throughout the city. So even though she lived as a recluse and a penitent, somehow people sensed her great sanctity, that there was this mystical power behind her, maybe this kind of innocence. Nevertheless, she wasn't canonized, and I believe rightly so, because although she was very devout, to an extreme degree, very prayerful, very faithful, very much in love with the person of Christ, this wishing for one's own death is something which is morally ambiguous in all circumstances, you know. This is not to say that it's always reprehensible, but on the other hand, it's not a good example, you know.
Right,
it's
right. It's not to be held up as something to be.
And I should mention also their lifestyle and their types of penances are far from edifying and far from good examples. Now, at the time, they were held to be, you know, evidences of great devotion. Yes, they were evidences of great devotion, but with the benefit of today's psychology, we'd probably say, you know, there's a little bit, well, more than a little bit disturbed, you know, the wearing of crowns of thorns and, you know, hot wax and all of that kind of business. I mean, you know, it was a thing, but these
why do you
days,
think that emerged? Sorry, I don't mean to sidetrack you, just out of interest.
Yeah.
What?
That is a very complex question. And I think it was partially to do with the repression of people's normal emotional lives. Possibly also due to the influence of more primitive cultures which had practiced, you know, a lot of primitive cultures have practiced not only human sacrifice, which certainly was a thing in South America and Central America, but also different degrees and different forms of basically self infliction of pain upon oneself. And I mean, a lot of the saints of the Catholic Church did this as well, but it's not something which we focus on today, and quite rightly so, I believe, because although, you know, physical self-discipline and control is a healthy thing, it always should be done with a view to one's health and well-being, you know. And this is a point I always make at Lent, and when I talk about fasting and self-denial, I say, you know, do this not to damage your body, do it to make your body healthier and stronger, which for 99% of the population it's going to do.
Right.
You know, but certainly in these cases it can be taken too far to extremes. So yeah, it is a complex question, which is both psychological and cultural. There was a very strong also identification with the figure of the crucified, the suffering Christ, which emerged in the late Middle Ages from about the time of the plagues.
Right, so great suffering in the general population.
Great suffering, and then there were the artistic depictions of this suffering. I believe they're no more graphic than within the Spanish-speaking world. And certainly a lot of things in Spain survived and took on even more extreme forms in the South American world, you know, because of that native influence. Which
right, so that's why the Santa Muerte didn't emerge in Spain itself primarily, but in the Spanish cultures that had been mixed with an indigenous.
And you know, but by this time in Spain, there were still lots of confraternities of a good death, where people would actually, you know, get together and pray for a good death because they believed, well, this is the indication of a good life. This is the consummation. This is one's gateway to heaven, to have a peaceful and holy and happy death. Now, but they did persist in distorted forms in, you know, in South America, but certainly in Spain by this time. We're talking here, we're talking about the 17th century, and the canonization was in the 18th century. It would not have gathered any interest at all amongst, you know, amongst Europeans because of the different level of situation and development. But I believe, you know, in the case of Mexico, my own opinion is that sometimes people say, oh, these are pagan gods, Mexican pagan deities, being kind of morphed with Catholic ones.
Mhm.
I don't believe that is actually the case at all. I believe it is actually quite simply the traditional veneration of this venerable Donna Sebastiana. But I think it was influenced by the culture in a kind of subconscious way, you know.
Yeah.
It's very seldom. In fact, there are virtually no cases I can think of where actual pagan things have merged with Christian things. They don't actually merge. What happens instead is that the pagan practice or way of thinking is still within people's mind, and it forms to some degree. It has a manifestation within Christianity. Now, a good example of that would be the celebration of Christmas. You know, this is in the Northern Hemisphere is midwinter. And so then basically coincides with the rising of new light and so forth. And it more or less matches the time of Christmas. And, you know, there's nothing which is absolutely pagan about celebrating the changing of seasons. You know, for a devout Catholic, it still makes sense to be, you know, to note the transition of midwinter, that henceforth the days are becoming longer, and the same, of course, with Easter.
Well, the cosmic cycles are seen as manifestations of God's logos in creation. So,
absolutely, you know, and we have within the church what are called Quartember days, which coincide with the seasons, basically, and these are times when people would pray for prosperity and success in the agriculture of the season that was to come. And also do works of penance. Not that we believe works of penance gain God's favor, but traditionally they've been considered a way of augmenting the force of prayer.
Interesting. So what we have here is a kind of a tension between an official church position that rightly doesn't canonize the figure for reasons that are quite legitimate, but at the same time a kind of cult that emerges among the folk, which is also legitimate, and a sense of the faithful that something is working through God, and these two things are in tension. That's quite difficult for a black and white mind, the mechanical mind of modernity to,
you know, absolutely. This is, and a lot of these pious societies in the Spanish-speaking world were formed with official approval, as is the case of this one. You know, and the fact that one of the two, so we have Saint Mariana, who was officially canonized, Donna Sebastiana, who was declared venerable, declared to be a servant of God by her bishop, but didn't make it through the canonization procedure, but is still legitimately venerated within her diocese. So there is this, absolutely, there is this tension, you know, and sometimes people imagine that the Catholic Church is like a monolithic organization, that everyone is like speaking off the same, you know, off the same script. To a certain degree, that's true, that we do care about unity, unity of essential doctrine. And increasingly in this age of communication where people know what's happening in different parts of the world. But on the other hand, there is legitimate diversity, you know, and to give you an example of this, a few years ago, Cardinal Robert Serra, who is an African cardinal, he was head of the doctrine for divine liturgy. And he said he wants people to start, priests to start celebrating the Mass ad orientem. In other words, facing in the same direction as the people, or some people would say with their backs to the people, but essentially it's everyone facing in the direction of God. And the backlash against that was tremendous, you know, particularly in the English-speaking world, but they were doing it in Africa, in parts of Africa all along without any problem. The same issue emerged recently in India, where certain this is within the Catholic Church, because there are different rites of the Catholic Church. Some were doing with ad versus populum, facing the people. Others were doing ad orientem, facing together in the direction of the east, of the rising sun, to celebrate the Mass. And this became actually a very serious conflict. We need there is this diversity. You could go to a Catholic church in one part of the world and find that the prayer, the style of Mass, processions, festivities, observances were quite different than in another part of the world. And this doesn't mean that we believe different things, but it means that we have sometimes different emphases, different ways of manifesting our view of the world. And, for example, one of the things we talked about was the worship we give to the Blessed Virgin Mary, which we call hyperdulia, which is a kind of veneration which extends beyond that of any of the saints, but isn't quite the same as recognition of a divinity. So it's midway between the two, if I could put it in a somewhat simplistic way. Now, to a lot of people from a Protestant background, even to some Catholics, they look at some of these statues of the Blessed Virgin Mary, particularly ones from South America or from Spain, to a lesser degree, other parts of Europe, and they look almost to them as if they're pagan idols.
Mm.
Now, they're actually not. There's no way they are. If you meet any of the people who venerate these things, they'll all be faithful Christians. They'll all believe in Christ as the Son of God. Of course they will. There's no worship of Mary outside of the belief in the divinity of Christ. But the point is, it can look culturally like it's similar to the pre-Christian idolatrous forms. And to me, this shouldn't worry us all that much. The reason being that I believe the pre-Christian forms actually anticipate the truths which we find perfectly expressed in Christianity. So people sometimes say, well, Jesus, he's a bit like Hercules, this demigod figure or superhuman figure who's then assumed into heaven or raised to divine status. Well, I would reply to that. It's not that Jesus is like Hercules. It's rather that Hercules is kind of anticipating the fullness which is found in Jesus. And Jesus, of course, is the archetype of this human divinization.
So it's kind of a demonstration of the power of truth itself, that something that's truly true in its most in the fullest form kind of infuses itself into God's creation and is able to be known through the reading of the natural world. Absolutely, Brian. And I believe that this is manifested in the close parallels we find in the religious beliefs throughout the world, that even if they don't have the benefit of revelation, purely on the basis of observation of the world, of understanding of their own human nature, of introspection, and of connection with these cosmic realities, they come to something which is very close to the truth. And you only need to think about the great influence of Plato on St. Augustine. The fact that the Neoplatonists were, a lot of what they believed was very, very similar to what the Christians believed, about the soul, about eternity, about the nature of God. Then Aristotle, of course, was a leading figure in the scholastic theology of the High Middle Ages and beyond. So these connections are not just coincidence, but they rather reflect this fundamental truth. If numerous people work on the same problem, each using different ways, they're going to eventually come to conclusions which tend to converge. Right. That's basically the position that we've been trying to illuminate on our podcast for the last few months. So I think thank you very much for kind of in a very concise way demonstrating that. I thought maybe we'd change track a little bit. I've got
Sure.
in my hand another one of your interesting translations called The Wizard Popes of the 11th Century by pseudo-cardinal Benot. I'm not sure exactly how it should be translated. And this is a very interesting document. Perhaps before we go into any depth into what's written in here, could you tell us a little bit about the 11th century, which is it's before the highest part of the medieval sort of 12th and 13th century, the golden age, as many people would see, of the great Gothic cathedrals. It's a bit of a dark spot in people's historical imagination. What was going on at this period?
It is, but it is actually a very important period of time. This was, of course, the century in which the William of Normandy conquered England. It's also a time when there was exchange in learning between the Arabs, particularly the Arabs in Spain. The Arabs were occupying much of Spain at that time, and Christian scholars. And this led to the introduction of algebra, alchemy, which eventually became chemistry, to the Arabic numeral system. So and also to the invention of astrolabes, clocks, telescopes. All of this dates to this period of time. And I believe it was a remarkable period of time. And what really got me interested in this was I was at the time translating some works by Saint Anselm, who was invited. He was basically born in Italy, was an abbot in France, was invited by William the Conqueror to come and be Archbishop of Canterbury. So I was reading up on this, and I came across one of the volumes in the Monumenta Germanica Historia, which was the history written by, or the chronicles written by, this pseudo-cardinal Benno. And I was fascinating, because I hadn't come across a pseudo-cardinal there. Well, a pseudo-cardinal was a pope, was a cardinal who was loyal to one of the anti-popes. Now, I should mention that during the 11th century, at certain times, there were up to 3 people claiming to be the pope. So it was a very confused era. We know a lot of saints from that time, St. Bernard of Clairvaux, St. Anselm of Canterbury, and so forth. And there's a few popes who were canonized. So most notably is Gregory VII, who was an important one for Benedictines.
And he makes an appearance in this work as well, which we'll cover later.
He does indeed. And it was a time when Benedictine monasteries were really flourishing. Fair to say that was possibly the best era for us Benedictines.
Interesting, but do you include the Cistercian movement as part of that flourishing, or is that...
yes, I do. I absolutely do. Sometimes people regard Cistercians as separate from the Benedictine flourishing, but Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, he wasn't actually the founder, but he was the one who really pushed the Cistercian movement. And he founded 300 monasteries in his lifetime. He was asked to judge between different claims to the papacy when there was 2 popes. He said, well, which is the real pope? And he was asked to decide. He was the most influential figure of his time, I believe. This is also the time of St. Hildegard of Bingen, who wrote wonderfully visions and works on natural medicine and science and so forth. Now, I consider them to be Benedictines. They follow the rule of Saint Benedict. If anything, they traditionally follow it with a more careful observation than other branches of Benedictines. So there was another movement of the Benedictines at the time, known as the Cluniacs, who placed great emphasis on learning, on beautiful liturgy. They would spend hours and hours every day on singing the divine office. Whereas St. Bernard wanted to get it back to the primitive roots of a more austere type of life, the monks doing manual labor themselves and everything. Our own congregation, we are the Subiaco Cassinese congregation. of the primitive observance. We are a kind of balance between those two. It varies from monastery to monastery. We are probably, our own monastery in New Norcia, despite the smallness of our community, are probably one of the more strongly hands-on monasteries in terms of our monastic observance, which personally I'm happy about. But yeah, I do consider the Cistercians to be completely Benedictine.
So you were sort of describing the 11th century milieu.
Yeah. And so at this time, of course, the papacy was not just a religious position. It was also a position of great wealth and of great military power. And traditionally, there were a number of families, number of noble Roman families, who basically chose the Pope. And, you know, this was something which actually extended well beyond the 11th century. It extended virtually until the Council of Trent, really. But in conflict with this was the emperor. Now, there was the Holy Roman Emperor who believed, and with a certain amount of historical justification, that he had to approve the Pope. So that both kind of went hand in hand. The Pope had to approve the Emperor had to approve the Pope. The reason being that they were both part of the same church. And the Emperor was understood as being part of the church. Now, what happened was there were differences sometimes between the Holy Roman Emperor, who was a German, and the Pope, who, of course, was traditionally an Italian. Exception to this was Saint Leo IX, who was German, was selected by the Emperor. He was sent to Rome, then he thought better of it, but he received a vision then that he should be the Pope. And he was one of the greatest popes, one of the couple of popes, along with Gregory VII, who was canonized. Interestingly, this anti-Cardinal Benno was loyal to the Emperor rather than the Pope. So he was loyal to the Emperor's Pope, who historically now is regarded as an anti-Pope.
Interesting.
If I could put it that way. He understood it as being a real Pope, of course. But he approves of Leo IX. So both sides approve of Leo IX, which I've actually translated some of the works of Leo IX. A very interesting character. Doesn't make it into this book on the popes accused of sorcery, however.
So what was the purpose behind Cardinal Benno's writing? Was it just to discredit these popes, or was it based on is his work reliable, or
yeah?
What do we to make of it?
You know, I believe it's not purely based on his desire to discredit those popes, although there is a big amount of that in it. But it's also based on suspicions which were aroused by one pope in particular, Pope Sylvester II, who a lot of writers of the time, William of Malmesbury and others, identify as having been a sorcerer.
Interesting.
Now, the reality is that he actually was a monk. He went and studied with the Arabs in Spain, and he learned chemistry, he learned advanced mathematics, and came back and wrote about these things. Now, you can imagine if you were a medieval monk or priest or layman, and you saw a work on advanced mathematics, or you saw someone performing chemical experiments, what would you conclude? You would conclude, of course, that that person was a sorcerer. If you came across a person who was accurately predicting the movement of the stars, or was able to, you know, tell you how many gallons you can fit into a huge vat just by writing on a piece of paper. If you were a medieval person, you would conclude that that was wizardry. If you saw someone mixing up chemicals and, you know, putting in chemicals of one color and another, and then another color coming out altogether, what would you conclude? That it was sorcery. So even though Sylvester II certainly wasn't a sorcerer, and none of these guys were, of course, but they were interested in the sciences and in mathematics, and they picked these up largely from the Arabs. And of course, a lot of Christians at the time saw the Arabs, saw Muslims basically as kind of devil worshippers. They identified, Baphomet is basically a corruption of the name Muhammad. So there was this type of, suspicion of any learning which came from the Arabs, whether it was ungodly superstition. And, if a person today bought modern technology, certainly if we bought the internet or mobile phones or even televisions back to the Middle Ages, you would be accused of sorcery. So I believe that's basically what the situation, because when we read the works of Sylvester II, his mathematical works, they're all perfectly legitimate. But to a person who doesn't understand them and sees this kind of complex working on paper, they're going to conclude that it's some type of Kabbalistic, some mystical invocation of spirits or whatever. So I think that is actually the case. I think all of these popes were learned people who were interested in the new learning coming in via the Arabs in Spain. And because of this, they became easy targets for accusations of witchcraft. Some of them might have been sincere. They might have really believed something fishy was going on. But I think in a lot of cases, their enemies or rivals would just take advantage of this as a way of arousing fear. So it was like a kind of fake news of the 11th century.
So Cardinal Benno is a bit of an unlettered barbarian who doesn't understand sort of what an educated man might look like.
Well, he is. But when we say he's uneducated, he could speak and write Latin more fluently than, and was probably familiar with the Bible, the writings of the saints and everything. So, he was certainly not an idiot. Right. But as far as science is concerned, he was.
So you've drawn a picture of these, before we go into any further detail, perhaps into the moral goodness and badness of some of these characters. You've drawn a picture that these men were kind of very interested in scientific pursuits, things that would fit quite comfortably within a more materialist modern conception of an enlightened man. But some of the descriptions that we have of these characters also involve sort of behavior of maybe understanding the language of the birds, which is obviously anybody who's read sort of into Hermetic philosophy or alchemy would understand as being a very pregnant series of terms. Do you think that this was high scientific learning mixed with mysticism?
Yes, absolutely. So, this idea of communication with animals is something which is, found in the Bible. Traditionally, Solomon is believed to have been able to communicate with birds and beasts. The story of Balaam's donkey, and also in a lot of the writings or the lives of the saints, we find this. It's a constant thing where Saint Francis of Assisi, for example, speaks to this wolf who fully understands, and the birds have no fear of him. So it's taken traditionally as a sign both of wisdom and of sanctity. So, to me, it is actually, I can't say I've experienced anything like it myself, but, from time to time, I have had something like a wild bird come and perch on my shoulder or something. And, there are people who, for whatever reason, have this natural sympathy with different species of animals. And it is kind of miraculous, but I believe that it's because animals can read people's character and feeling, and they sense when there is that compassion, that innocence, and that harmlessness towards them. And
in a
this is
harmony within a person.
Absolutely, and I think that that there was that in the case of this work, he's treating it as a sign of sinister things going on. In the case of Gregory VII, it was said that when he was celebrating Mass, a white dove would appear. And now this is actually documented for a lot of saints. I mean, probably at least half a dozen saints when they celebrated Mass, it was said that always a white dove would appear. And to me, this is perfectly fine. This is a sign of sanctity, and no doubt based on the actual fact that this person did exude this sanctity and innocence and harmony. But it can be interpreted in a negative way as well, which is something we see in this work.
So the popes that Cardinal Benno smears, or pseudo Cardinal Benno smears, are actually, from today's perspective, they're not all good either. So there is one individual, at least, Pope Benedict IX, who's considered a profoundly evil man. Yeah.
So now he became Pope at a very early age, probably in his early 20s. Some sources say that he became Pope when he was just 12. That, of course, is absurd. But, he became Pope very young due to family influence, due to political influence of his family. And, a lot of people became cardinals at a young age. St. Charles Borromeo was appointed a cardinal at the age of 16.
Wow.
And this is much, much later. This is like in the 1600s. And he's a canonized saint. So the thing is, he did become Pope. He was basically ousted as Pope by the emperor and by his rivals. And then he came back and he claimed to be Pope again. And so he actually had 3 times when he claimed to be Pope. It seemed like morally he was a very weak character. So, he indulged in banqueting, feasting, drinking, womanizing, and so forth. Now, there were other popes who did this as well. I don't want to, exaggerate this, because certainly the enemies of the papacy have exaggerated it. But, it's fair to say that not all the popes have been models of good behavior and so forth. Having said that, we still believe that the Holy Spirit ultimately chooses each of these popes. And you think about these bad popes, I say this in inverted commas, these bad popes generally don't last for very long. Most of them last for less than a year. And a lot of the popes who he speaks of here last between a year and 2 or 3. And then get ousted or poisoned or murdered or accidentally die or something. But the thing is that when we read the actual writings of this Benedict IX, he's perfectly orthodox in his faith. There's no doubt that he's a faithful Catholic. So the idea of dabbling in witchcraft and so forth is pretty absurd. The worst, and I say this, is that they would have dabbled in mathematics or chemistry or the new scientific discoveries, perhaps wondered if they could succeed in manufacturing gold or prolonging their life by the use of medicines and so forth. Now, this was not in itself was not anything wicked in itself. This was the science of the time. People believed these things were in principle possible, so they were keen to investigate, to get experts to instruct them. So I think that is probably closer to the reality.
Interesting. And something else that struck me as I was reading was the Pope Sylvester II, on his sort of deathbed, so to speak. He made some very strange requests about having his tongue and if I remember correctly, his hand cut off.
Yeah.
And this is interpreted in various ways, but is the story reliable?
Okay. So the story is that he was told that he wouldn't die until he sang the Mass at Jerusalem. And so he he decided he's never going to go to Jerusalem, but he went to a certain church in Rome, which is known as Jerusalem, for whatever reason. And he said Mass there. And then after that, he fell down, collapsed, and basically was about to die. Then he asked that his hands and tongue be cut off and removed, because he had only sinned with his hands and with his tongue. Now, this story is, of course, absurd. There's no way it's going to be true. And if it was true, who would have recorded it? How would anyone have come to know this story? You know, what's more likely is that someone desecrated his body and cut off the hands and tongue and then made up this story. You know, that was the kind of thing which tended to happen in the Middle Ages. Because, you know, when you hear stories about people's final words and everything, I always ask myself, who was there listening to these final words and writing them down?
Yeah.
And surely this would be the kind of thing that if a person was going to say, they would, you know, they wouldn't make public. So no, I think it's more a case of imagination. I believe even during the Middle Ages, when people heard these stories, for example, the story of the female pope, they basically know that they're not true. You know, and a lot of stories, three-headed cows being born, people knew they weren't true, but they passed them on because they were good stories, you know, and there was a culture of the time of the love of the good story and not necessarily letting strict veracity get in the way of that.
Is that when you're talking about the desecration of the Pope's body, sounds sort of extremely distant and dark age, but it reminds me of your own Australian Cardinal Pell, where I don't know if what you think of the rumors, or if you've heard of the rumors that there was a degree of desecration that happened to his body that sort of emerged, that the stories were published recently. Obviously had a lot of enemies.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and at one stage, this is a historically documented fact. One of the popes, after he was dead, he was exhumed and his dead body was placed on trial and then executed. So that's obviously in the Middle Ages, the dark period of the Middle Ages. But yes, with Cardinal Pell, there is this great animosity towards him, which is completely, in my opinion, you know, I met him. He was a decent, thoroughly decent fellow, stood up for what he believed, and, you know, spoke out against things, but he didn't say anything which was not in perfect harmony with Catholic teaching. People felt an animosity towards him. I'm not sure exactly why. He was certainly a strong character. And you know, whenever a person is in a position of leadership, and especially if they're a strong character, if they're personally gifted, then they have enemies. This is just a reality of life. And so it's very, very unfortunate that the way some of the treatment which Cardinal Pell suffered both during his life and as you mentioned now, a kind of ongoing animosity towards him, which you know, feeling animosity towards the dead is one of the most absurd things that can possibly be imagined. Interesting.
So I can't remember where I read about it, but I was reading that there's a kind of disordered hatred of another person's virtue that can emerge in somebody who isn't virtuous themselves, and that perhaps what we're reading about in this work by Pseudo Cardinal Benno is exactly this, that he's kind of just driven to anger at other people's sanctity.
There is certainly, you know, and the way he talks about Gregory VII, who was, you know, a great miracle worker and exemplary for holiness, he misinterprets, or he interprets all the signs of sanctity as kind of fake virtue, you know, and says it's all just put on. And I think that's quite a common phenomena in human psychology. When people encounter someone with a different level of virtue than themselves, or even a different form of talent or giftedness or whatever, then there is often this desire to cut them down, to
The sin
disparage.
of Cain.
Yes, and I think this is, in Australia we call it the tall poppy syndrome, and I think it's something where when we look at people who exceed ourselves in whatever respect, and they offer to us a lesson, an example, something to strive after, that human beings shouldn't consider each other to be rivals, should consider ourselves to be, part of this common human family, and we should rejoice in all forms of human excellence. And to me, Cardinal Pell, he exemplified so many aspects. He was a very gifted scholar, very gifted preacher. In his earlier life, he'd been a very gifted football player as well, and a very charismatic person. So, I thought very highly of him myself.
Well, this has been a very interesting discussion about, I think, some of the most interesting material that I've read in the last few months, and I think you've really helped illuminate the subject for me, and I imagine for the listeners. So thank you very much for joining us on the Nostalgia Podcast, and I hope in the future we'll be able to discuss some more of your translations and discoveries. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Brian. And if I could conclude with a blessing, may the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit come down upon you and all of your listeners and remain with you always.